My beloved child. The photograph was already trembling in your soulmate's hand when the psychic pushed it gently back across the table and said something neither of them had come prepared to hear. The third party had expected a warning about you. Your soulmate had expected, perhaps, confirmation that you were struggling more than you admitted. Instead, the psychic stared at one tiny detail near the edge of the photograph, then at a folded note beside the phone, and quietly asked, "Who taught this person to survive without letting anyone see the cost?" That question was the beginning of everything. Because only minutes later, the third party would leave the room with nothing left to prove, and your soulmate would be sitting there with tears of relief they had been holding back for far too long. The strange part was that the meeting had never been meant to end that way. Earlier that afternoon, there had been tension between them over something deceptively simple: money. Not greed. Not luxury. Not some dramatic secret fortune. It began because the third party had noticed that whenever your name came up, your soulmate spoke about your future with a kind of certainty that seemed impossible to explain. You might be private. You might not show everything you are working toward. Maybe you have even seemed cautious at times, choosing what is practical over what is impressive. To someone watching from the outside, that restraint could easily be misunderstood. The third party had interpreted it as uncertainty. Your soulmate had interpreted it differently. There had been little things they could not forget. The way you seemed to think before spending on yourself but rarely hesitated when someone else genuinely needed help. The way you could carry a responsibility quietly and never announce that it had cost you sleep, time, or comfort. The way you seemed less interested in appearing successful than in becoming stable enough that nobody you loved would have to panic when life became unpredictable. Those details had stayed with your soulmate. The third party saw the same behavior and asked a different question. What if you're imagining potential that isn't really there? That sentence was why they eventually found themselves sitting across from the psychic. Not because either person expected some guaranteed prediction. The appointment had been framed more like a symbolic reading, something that might reveal patterns they had been too emotionally involved to see clearly. The third party wanted perspective. Your soulmate wanted reassurance. Neither admitted how much the answer mattered. On the table sat three objects. Your photograph. A phone with an old conversation open. And a sealed envelope containing a handwritten number the third party had asked your soulmate to write down before they entered. The number was not supposed to represent your bank balance. It represented the amount your soulmate believed you would need before you ever allowed yourself to feel truly secure. That distinction would become important later. At first, the psychic barely looked at the number. Her attention stayed on the phone. There was a message from months earlier, almost ordinary enough to ignore. You had written something about needing to sort a few things out first, before making a decision. Nothing dramatic. No explanation. No complaint. Just a quiet postponement. The third party pointed to it immediately. There. That's what I mean. Always waiting. Always preparing. Never quite there. Your soulmate's fingers tightened slightly around the photograph. For a moment, it seemed as though the third party's interpretation might win. Then the psychic asked, "What happened the week this message was sent?" Silence. Your soulmate looked down. They remembered. Someone close to you had needed help. You had shifted something in your own life to make room for another responsibility. Maybe it had been time. Maybe a payment you had planned for yourself. Maybe an opportunity you delayed because another person needed stability more urgently. Whatever the exact circumstance, you had not told everyone what you were carrying. You simply handled it. The third party's expression changed first. Only slightly. Because the message that had looked like evidence of hesitation suddenly meant something else. It was not, "I am afraid to move forward." It might have been, "I am making sure nobody falls while I do." That was the first answer. And it softened the room. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The hum of the air conditioner suddenly felt louder. Your soulmate placed the photograph flat on the table and ran one thumb along its corner, as though remembering every moment they had mistaken your quietness for distance. The psychic did not romanticize it. She said, "Being responsible can become a burden if someone believes they must carry everything alone." Your soulmate nodded immediately. That part they recognized. There had been times when they wanted you to explain yourself more. To say when you were tired. To admit when something was difficult. To stop answering, "I'm fine, I'm just figuring things out," when your eyes suggested a much longer story. And perhaps that had been one reason the third party had gained influence in the first place. Unexplained silence creates room for other people's interpretations. The third party had not entered your soulmate's life intending to destroy anything. They had simply seen uncertainty and tried to protect someone they cared about from disappointment. Comparison had gradually become confidence. Confidence had gradually become assumption. "You need someone more settled," they had once told your soulmate. It sounded reasonable at the time. Now the psychic lifted the sealed envelope. She did not open it. Instead she asked your soulmate, "Why did you choose the number inside?" Your soulmate hesitated. "Because I think that's the point where they'd finally breathe. Not celebrate. Not show off. Breathe." The word made the psychic pause. She placed the envelope back down. "That tells me more about this relationship than the number ever could." The third party leaned forward, confused. Your soulmate looked even more unsettled. Because the conversation was no longer really about money. It was about what money represented to you. Safety. Choice. The ability to help without putting yourself in danger. The freedom to say yes to love without secretly wondering whether one unexpected problem could pull everything apart. Stay with this moment, because one detail has not yet been explained. The psychic returned to the photograph and pointed toward something barely visible near your wrist. It was ordinary, perhaps the edge of a watch, a worn bracelet, a sleeve, or simply the way you were holding something out of frame. Yet it reminded your soulmate of a memory. They had seen you wear the same thing during a period when everyone assumed you were doing well. You had smiled. You had shown up. You had helped people. Nobody knew you were rebuilding quietly at the same time. That memory hit differently now. Your soulmate's face changed. Not because they suddenly believed you were secretly wealthy. That was never the revelation. They remembered how carefully you had lived through a difficult stretch without letting hardship turn you bitter. They remembered how you had started paying attention to small decisions. How you had stopped chasing things merely because they looked impressive. How you had begun valuing consistency over appearance. The struggle had not proved you were incapable of stability. It had taught you why stability mattered. That realization landed so quietly that even the third party did not interrupt it. For a few moments, your soulmate stared at the phone. Then they whispered, "I thought they were pulling away from me." The psychic asked, "When?" "Whenever they got quiet." "And now?" Your soulmate swallowed. "Now I'm wondering if they were trying to become ready." There it was. The second answer. Not a fantasy. Not a promise of some perfect future. A reinterpretation. Your soulmate had spent months wondering whether your pauses meant lack of commitment. Suddenly, they could see another possibility. Perhaps some of those pauses came from taking commitment so seriously that you did not want to offer words you were not prepared to support with actions. That did not erase every misunderstanding between you. It did something more useful. It made your behavior understandable. The third party looked uncomfortable now, though not angry. They glanced toward the unopened envelope as if wishing the conversation could return to numbers. Numbers were easier. Numbers could be compared. Character could not. Then the psychic asked the third party a question. "What answer were you hoping I would give?" The room went still again. At first, the third party laughed softly. Not mockingly. Nervously. Finally they admitted, "I thought you'd say this person wasn't stable enough. I thought maybe it would help them move on." Your soulmate looked over. There was no explosion. Only disappointment mixed with understanding. "You were trying to protect me?" The third party lowered their eyes. "I was trying to make the uncertainty stop." That sentence changed something. Because uncertainty had been hurting all of them in different ways. You had been protecting plans you were not ready to explain. Your soulmate had been interpreting your privacy through emotion. The third party had been interpreting the gaps through fear. Nobody had possessed the whole picture. The psychic finally touched the envelope again. This time she opened it. Your soulmate had written a figure inside. The third party expected the psychic to comment on whether it was realistic. She did not. She turned the paper around and asked your soulmate to read what they had written underneath the number. Your soulmate had forgotten there was anything else there. Beneath the figure, in smaller handwriting, were 4 words. "So they can rest." That was when your soulmate's eyes filled. Because they suddenly realized something about themselves. They had not chosen that number while imagining you standing beside a luxury car, a giant house, or anything designed to impress strangers. They had imagined you sleeping peacefully. They had imagined your shoulders finally relaxing. They had imagined you no longer calculating whether helping one person would mean sacrificing something essential for yourself. Their idea of your success was not status. It was relief. And somehow, without realizing it, your soulmate had understood you more deeply than the third party ever had. The psychic let the paper remain between them. "Interesting," she murmured. You came here asking whether this person could build stability. Yet your own answer shows that what you want most is for them to stop carrying everything alone. Your soulmate wiped beneath one eye and laughed once, quietly, embarrassed by the emotion. The third party said nothing. Then came the detail that made everyone believe the reading was finished. The psychic explained that the pattern in front of her suggested someone who had learned to prepare privately rather than perform publicly. Someone whose relationship with security had been shaped by seeing how quickly circumstances can change. Someone who might take longer to trust a new chapter because they do not want to build on something fragile. It fit almost too neatly. Your soulmate relaxed back into the chair. They finally believed they understood. You were careful because life had taught you caution. That seemed to explain everything. Except it did not. The psychic looked again at the old conversation on the phone and noticed the date. Her expression sharpened. She asked your soulmate to scroll upward. 3 messages earlier, you had said something small that nobody had considered important. When the time is right, I want to do this properly. Your soulmate stared at the sentence. The third party leaned closer. Those words had been there all along. Suddenly, the story changed. Your silence had not only been defensive. Some of it had been constructive. You were not merely recovering from old instability. You had been trying to prepare for something specific. Maybe not with a grand secret plan. Maybe not with perfect certainty. But there was intention underneath the caution. That was the deeper contradiction. You could appear hesitant while actually being deliberate. You could move slowly because you cared about permanence. You could delay speaking because once you said something, you wanted your life to move in the same direction as your words. The psychic's voice softened. This is not someone waiting for life to rescue them. Your soulmate looked up. This is someone trying to become dependable enough that love does not have to rescue them. The tears came then. Not dramatic sobbing. Just quiet, unstoppable tears. Your soulmate pressed a hand against their mouth and looked away for a moment, as though that sentence had found a place inside them they had never been able to name. Because suddenly they remembered every time they had wanted to fix things for you. Every time they had thought love meant pulling you out of uncertainty. Perhaps they had never considered that what you wanted was not to be rescued. You wanted to arrive beside them standing on your own feet. The third party watched them carefully. Whatever need they had carried into that room to compare, to prove, to settle the argument was fading. They reached for their bag. Not angrily. Not defeated. Simply with the expression of someone who had finally realized they were standing inside a story that belonged to 2 other people. I think I've said too much about something I didn't understand, they said. Your soulmate looked at them for a long moment. Then nodded. There was sadness in it, but also release. No argument followed. No dramatic confrontation. The third party stood, thanked the psychic, and quietly left. The door clicked shut. That was how they were finally gone from the conversation. Not punished. Not humiliated. Simply no longer needed as an interpreter between 2 people whose connection had been distorted by too many assumptions. For the first time that afternoon, your soulmate sat alone with what they actually felt. And what they felt was relief. Not because every uncertainty had disappeared. Because one damaging misunderstanding had. They had believed your private nature meant there was no room for them inside your plans. Now they were beginning to wonder whether the opposite had been true. Perhaps some of the planning existed precisely because you had imagined a future big enough to include another person. The psychic gathered the photograph, the envelope, and the phone into a neat line. Then she stopped. One final thing had caught her attention. Not in the photograph. Not in the amount. On the back of the paper your soulmate had written on before the session, there was a faint mark from another page that had once rested on top of it. Indented handwriting. Almost invisible unless the light hit it from the side. The psychic tilted the sheet toward the lamp. Your soulmate leaned forward. A few words slowly became readable. They recognized the handwriting. It was their own. They had written those words weeks earlier on another piece of paper, apparently while thinking about you, then forgotten the page had been underneath. The psychic traced the indentation without reading it aloud immediately. Your soulmate's breathing changed. Because the sentence was not about money at all. It contained your name. And beside it was a private promise they had never told the third party, never told the psychic, and had barely admitted to themselves. The psychic looked from the paper to your soulmate's tearful face. Then, very softly, she said, "Now I understand why this affected you so deeply. The part you thought you were waiting for them to become ready for." She turned the paper fully toward your soulmate. Was actually something you had already decided. Your soulmate stared at the faint handwriting. Their eyes closed for a second, and another tear slipped free. The psychic pointed to the final words beneath your name and began, "And the reason you wrote this promise that night is because you had already realized that they were quietly preparing to build the one thing you have been afraid to ask anyone for." Her finger stopped beneath the last line. Your soulmate opened their eyes. And the psychic finally began to read it aloud. The psychic's voice became almost a whisper. "I wrote this because I want them to feel safe enough to stop surviving alone." Your soulmate did not move. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint hum above them and the soft movement of the paper beneath the psychic's fingertips. The sentence was theirs. The handwriting was theirs. Yet hearing it spoken aloud made it feel like something they had been hiding from themselves. That was why the tears returned. Not because the psychic had predicted some perfect future. Not because a mysterious fortune had suddenly appeared. Your soulmate cried because they realized their deepest hope had never really been about changing you. They wanted to become a place where you did not have to carry everything by yourself. The psychic pushed the paper toward them. "Do you remember writing it?" Your soulmate nodded slowly. "Not exactly when." "Then remember what was happening around that time." That question opened another door. A few weeks earlier, your soulmate had watched you handle a situation that almost nobody else noticed. There had been no dramatic announcement. No public struggle. Just one of those ordinary moments that reveals a person more clearly than 100 promises ever could. Someone had needed something from you. Your own plans were already tight. Still, you found a way. Maybe you moved an expense. Maybe you gave up a small comfort. Maybe you spent an evening solving a problem that was not technically yours to solve. Whatever form it took, your soulmate remembered something specific afterward. You never mentioned what you had sacrificed. That had bothered them. At the time, they thought your silence meant you did not trust them enough to share your burdens. Now the meaning began to change. Perhaps you had become so accustomed to being dependable that asking someone else to carry part of the weight felt unnatural. That realization made your soulmate lower their eyes. The psychic noticed. You're regretting something. Your soulmate took a breath. I kept thinking they were shutting me out. And what do you think now? A pause. Maybe they didn't know how to let someone in without feeling like a burden. The word seemed to surprise even them. There was no accusation in their voice anymore. Only recognition. This was the moment the third party's absence became important. Earlier, every uncertainty had been filtered through somebody else's opinion. Why had you not called? Why were you taking so long? Why were you so careful? Why did you keep plans private until they were almost finished? The third party had always offered an interpretation. Maybe you were unsure. Maybe you were not ready. Maybe your priorities were elsewhere. Now nobody was there to answer for you. Your soulmate had to sit with the evidence themselves. And the evidence was becoming uncomfortable in a completely different way. Because many of the things they had taken as signs of distance could also be signs of preparation. The phone lit up on the table. A notification appeared. Not from you. Your soulmate glanced at it instinctively, then turned the screen face down. That small action made the psychic smile faintly. You came here hoping someone would tell you what this person feels. Your soulmate looked up. Yes. But the more important question may be what you have finally understood about what they do. There was a difference. Feelings could be misunderstood. Actions left patterns. The psychic placed your photograph beside the handwritten sentence. You said they rarely talk about what they're building until something is certain. Yes. You said they are cautious with themselves but generous when someone genuinely needs them. Yes. You said they once walked away from something they wanted because the timing would have created more instability. Your soulmate's eyes narrowed slightly. They had almost forgotten telling her that. Yes. The psychic tapped the table once. Those are not separate details. The sentence landed quietly. For the first time, the pieces were being connected. You had not merely been struggling and recovering. You had been developing a philosophy. Do not promise what you cannot sustain. Do not spend simply to impress. Do not build a future that collapses the first time life becomes difficult. Help where you can, but learn enough discipline that helping others does not destroy your own foundation. Your soulmate had seen pieces of that philosophy for months without recognizing the pattern. Now they did. And strangely, that realization brought warmth before it brought pain. Because beneath all their previous frustration was something they had never stopped feeling. Respect. They respected how you kept going. They respected that difficulty had not made you cruel. They respected that being underestimated had not pushed you into constantly proving yourself. Sometimes you had simply let people think what they wanted while you continued working. The psychic watched your soulmate's face soften. That's the part you loved first, isn't it? Your soulmate gave a small, embarrassed smile. What? The fact that they never needed a room to applaud them. That broke something open. Your soulmate laughed through the tears. Yes. For the first time since entering that room, they looked happy without also looking afraid. They remembered an ordinary conversation with you. Someone else had been talking about status, numbers, appearances, all the usual measurements people use when they want life to look impressive from the outside. You had listened quietly. Then you had said something simple. I just want enough peace that the people I love don't have to worry all the time. At the time, your soulmate thought it was just a nice sentence. Now it sounded like a blueprint. The psychic did not need to tell them that. Your soulmate said it themselves. That's what they've been doing. What? Building toward peace. The room felt different after those words. Lighter. Not because every problem had been solved. Because one question finally had. You had never been chasing money simply for money. Security represented something more personal. A home where panic did not control every decision. The ability to make choices without constantly calculating the worst possible outcome. The freedom to care for someone without secretly resenting what caring cost. A life where love could be generous without becoming financially reckless. That was the partial answer your soulmate had needed. Yet the psychic still seemed unsettled by something. She picked up the old phone conversation again. Scroll farther down. Your soulmate did. Several messages passed. Ordinary jokes. A short disagreement. A late-night exchange. Then one message stopped the psychic. It had been sent by your soulmate. I wish you'd let me help. Your reply beneath it was only 6 words. I need to do this myself. Your soulmate's face immediately tightened. There. That's the part that hurt. The psychic nodded. I can see why. For a moment, the old interpretation returned. Maybe you really had pushed them away. Maybe pride had been part of it. Maybe being independent had become so important that you had accidentally made love feel unnecessary. The psychic did not excuse that possibility. Strength can become isolation if nobody is allowed close enough to participate. Your soulmate looked down. That was difficult to hear. Because the reading was no longer turning you into some flawless figure. It was revealing the cost of the same qualities they admired. Discipline could become rigidity. Privacy could become emotional distance. Responsibility could become the belief that asking for help was failure. Your soulmate rubbed their thumb across the edge of the phone. I wanted them to know I wasn't offering help because I thought they were weak. Did you tell them that? I tried. Did you tell them clearly? Silence. Your soulmate shook their head. They had assumed you understood. Just as you had assumed they understood why you needed time. 2 people had been speaking in unfinished sentences and expecting love to translate the rest. That realization was almost funny. Almost. Your soulmate smiled sadly. We made everything harder than it needed to be. The psychic leaned back. Most people do when something matters enough. The softness of the answer eased the tension. Then your soulmate noticed something unusual. The sealed envelope was still open on the table, but underneath the handwritten number was another faint line they had not seen earlier. The paper had been folded directly through it. They lifted it closer. There was a second sentence. Not indented. Written intentionally. They had added it themselves before the appointment and somehow forgotten. If I'm wrong, I need to know. The psychic looked at them. Wrong about what? Your soulmate stared at those words. That was the question beneath the entire visit. Not whether you had enough money. Not whether you were successful enough. Not even whether the third party was correct. Your soulmate had been afraid they were wrong about your heart. They had defended you in conversations while privately wondering whether they had imagined the depth of what existed between you. Every quiet period had made that fear worse. Every delayed conversation had given it another shape. So when the third party suggested the psychic, part of your soulmate agreed because they wanted permission to stop hoping. That truth stunned them. I think I came here ready to let go, they admitted. The psychic did not react dramatically. Did you? I thought so. And now? Your soulmate looked at your photograph. No. That single word carried more emotion than anything they had said all afternoon. They were not crying because they had been promised you would return. They were crying because the evidence had given their hope a different foundation. Not fantasy. Understanding. They could finally see that your delays might not have meant indifference. Your caution might not have meant lack of feeling. Your silence might still have hurt them, but it no longer automatically meant there had been nothing beneath it. Listen closely to what happened next. The psychic reached for the photograph, then stopped halfway. Was this taken before or after the message where they said they needed to do it themselves? After. How long after? Your soulmate checked the date. 11 days. The psychic pointed at something in the background of the image. It was not mystical. Just an ordinary detail your soulmate had overlooked. A cardboard box. Partially visible behind you. Your soulmate stared at it. They knew that box. You had mentioned reorganizing your things around that time. Nothing more. The psychic asked, did they move? No. Start a new job? No. Sell something? Your soulmate thought. Then their expression changed. Wait. There had been a conversation. Short. Easy to forget. You had said you were clearing out things you did not need anymore. Your soulmate had teased you about suddenly becoming minimalist. You had laughed. At the time it meant nothing. Now another memory surfaced. A few weeks after that photograph, you had mentioned canceling something you rarely used. Then another small expense disappeared. Then you started talking differently about time. Less about what you wanted to buy. More about what you wanted to build. Your soulmate sat straighter. Oh. The psychic did not need to explain. Your soulmate already understood. Those changes had begun before the misunderstanding between you reached its worst point. That mattered. Because it meant you had not started becoming more disciplined to prove something to them afterward. You had already been changing privately. The plan existed before the distance. The third party had believed your slow progress meant lack of direction. Your soulmate had feared it meant lack of commitment. Yet the timeline suggested something else entirely. You had begun simplifying your life at exactly the moment you had started speaking more seriously about the future. The contradiction changed the meaning of everything. Your caution was not merely about recovering from struggle. It was connected to a decision. A quiet one. Perhaps not fully formed. Perhaps never spoken aloud. But real enough to affect your behavior. Your soulmate covered their mouth again. This time the tears came with a smile. The psychic asked, "What are you remembering?" Your soulmate looked almost embarrassed to say it. "There was a night when they asked me what kind of place made me feel peaceful." The psychic waited. "I thought it was just conversation." "What did you say?" "A small place. Quiet. Enough room for people we love to visit. Nothing extravagant." Your soulmate laughed softly. "They asked whether I cared about having something impressive. And I said I cared more about feeling safe there." The psychic glanced at the handwritten sentence. "So they can rest." The words suddenly belonged to both of you. That was the emotional turn your soulmate had not expected. They had thought they were the one imagining a shared future. Perhaps you had been imagining it too, just in your own language. Not dramatic declarations. Questions. Calculations. Removing unnecessary expenses. Learning patience. Trying to become more dependable. The kind of preparation that nobody notices until someone places the pieces in the right order. Your soulmate leaned back and let the realization settle. For a while, the psychic said nothing. The room needed the silence. Because this was not a moment for more mystery. It was a moment for relief. A struggle your soulmate had once interpreted as evidence that you were falling behind now appeared differently. Perhaps some of those difficult seasons had trained you to notice what mattered. You learned the cost of instability. So you began valuing consistency. You learned how exhausting it was to carry too much. So you started imagining a future designed around fewer emergencies. You learned that appearances could vanish quickly. So you stopped using appearance as your main measure of progress. Pain had not magically become good. It had simply taught you something. And you had used the lesson. That was why your soulmate's happiness felt so intense. They were not happy that you had struggled. They were happy the struggle had not been meaningless. You had turned part of it into wisdom. The psychic finally spoke. "There's still one thing I don't understand." Your soulmate's smile faded slightly. "What?" She placed the photograph beside the old message and the paper with the handwritten number. "These all point toward preparation." "Yes. But preparation for what?" The question returned the mystery. Your soulmate looked from one object to another. They had an answer now, but it felt too vulnerable to say. The psychic noticed. You already have an idea. Your soulmate hesitated. Then whispered, "A life with me." No prediction followed. No dramatic certainty. The psychic simply asked, "Why does saying that scare you?" Your soulmate's eyes lowered. "Because if I'm wrong, then I've built hope around things they never meant." There it was. The deepest fear beneath the tears. They could survive disappointment. What frightened them was discovering they had misunderstood your intentions completely. The psychic nodded. "That is fair." Then she reached for the photograph once more. "Which is why we should not assume." Your soulmate looked relieved by the grounded answer. "Then how do we know?" "We don't know everything." The psychic turned the photograph over. "But sometimes people leave evidence of what mattered to them even when they never explained it directly." There was handwriting on the back. Your soulmate froze. They had never seen it. The photograph had been in an old envelope for months. They had pulled it out in a hurry before coming and never checked the reverse side. 2 lines were written there. The first was a date. The second was not fully visible because a small piece of tape covered the final words. Your soulmate recognized your handwriting immediately. Their fingers began to shake again. The psychic gently peeled back only the loose edge of the tape. Enough to expose 3 words. "Once I'm ready." Your soulmate stopped breathing for a second. The rest remained hidden. They looked at the date again. It was from the same week you had asked what kind of home made them feel peaceful. The same week the box had appeared in the photograph. The same period when you had begun simplifying your life. 3 separate details had suddenly become one story. Your soulmate whispered, "Why would they write that on the back?" The psychic studied the remaining covered line. Maybe the photograph was a reminder. Of what? The psychic did not answer immediately. She looked at your soulmate with an expression that made their eyes fill again, not because something frightening had appeared, but because the last hidden words were clearly more personal than anything else on the table. Your soulmate reached for the tape. Then stopped. "Read it." The psychic carefully lifted the remaining corner. A longer sentence appeared beneath it. Your soulmate saw the first few words and broke into tears before the psychic could finish. "Because after, once I'm ready." You had written something that explained why the planning, the restraint, the distance, and even your refusal to accept help had all become tangled together. The psychic looked at your soulmate, then back at the line. "So this," she said softly, "is why you're crying with happiness." Your soulmate nodded, unable to speak. The psychic traced the final sentence with one finger. "These words are not about becoming rich. They are not about proving yourself to anyone. They are about the exact moment you hoped would come after you finally felt stable enough." She turned the photograph fully toward your soulmate. Their eyes locked onto the last line. The psychic took a quiet breath. Then she began to read the words you had written about what you wanted to do with your soulmate once you finally believed you were ready.